Hello everybody, welcome to my speech, so to speak, and thank you very much for accepting my paper, of course, for today. I hope I will be able to contribute a little bit to some of the ideas that Roland spoke about just earlier about the magical use of images and writing. I had like a lot of examples going on in my head while Roland was doing his talk. So we'll talk about it maybe next time, hopefully. Let's start with some basics about just the Egyptian hieroglyphic system and graphic communication for those of you who are not familiar with it. Basically, we can say that the Egyptian hieroglyphic system, the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic system, since its inception, has been a very much so twofold project in that one part of it, like as it's visible in this example, is intended to notate language, that I will be keep calling glottography throughout this presentation and not writing for several theoretical reasons. Whereas usually the latter part of the words, which is squared here in yellow, is like a type of image that we call determinatives in Egyptology, which is a rather unfortunate name, but there are no better alternatives really to what they do. The idea is roughly that this one, two, or three last signs of a word will not have a linguistic reading, but instead of that, it will give you an idea about what the word wants to mean, whereas the first couple of signs, as you can see, I wrote the consonants that they represent directly next to them, is the glottographic or linguistic notational part. So language and image are from the inception of this whole system are very much so next to each other. As you can see in this next slide as well, it's not exactly where this overlap ends, rather this is where it begins, because hieroglyphs that are scaled and shrunk to each other's size and linearly organized in this inscription above the head of the two, while one of them is rowing, the other one is holding two objects, actually can contain the very same images as determinatives. So at the end of the words, signaling something about the meaning of these words as part of bigger compositions, as you can see. So these overlaps gave a lot of space for the Egyptians to be able to maneuver with all sorts of playful ways of expressing meaning for a purpose. But it also points to the fact that glottography and images, are, at least in ancient Egyptian culture, are very close to each other for numerous reasons that perhaps I will be able to demonstrate today. So this is basically the Grundlagen, the basic information for today's presentation. And now I will give you a couple of examples through which we can ascertain somehow the theory of images on ancient Egypt, which will be, again, like another basic thing for this presentation for some of the case studies. So what you see here is like it's a scene from an ancient Egyptian temple that is visibly damaged in many different places. So this is a type of interaction with an image that has been designed for a temple, used in a temple, and then later when the temple stopped functioning, probably in Christian times, was damaged, illustrating how people still understood the theory of images in ancient Egypt, even though when they were probably Christian at this stage. Moving on to the next example, I could point out that even when images are scaled to each other's size and linearly organized and turned towards one single direction, which are all hallmarks of the hieroglyphic system, they are still perceived as images, which is visible from these two examples right here, where in the upper row we see an owl whose head, tail, and leg has been cut out, and a viper whose head, horn viper whose head was also cut out as a type of interaction after the purported monument finished its lifetime. Notice that these are glottographic signs, so they are originally purported Their aim was to represent linguistic notation, and yet still their iconic qualities are there, which is shown by the damage they received. But one line below them, there is one sign which was a determinative, and it also received, so a non-glottographic sign also received the same treatment, showing that both glottographic and non-glottographic images underlying them was the Egyptian theory of images. A further interesting example could be this, again, from an interaction after the design process, after the monument stopped functioning, are these vertical strokes where people came, they saw some sacred images, they were able to interpret these sacred images and the theory of images behind them, and then they made some scratchings to scrape off powder from these images that would have been probably ingested for healing and protective purposes in magical rituals, a little bit similar to what Roland talked about ingesting some of those writings of magical qualities. So probably underlying these are similar types of thinking. But part of the design process was also the interaction with these images. We can see these lines of hieroglyphs where certain animals like the bee here be mutilated without a head, or the snakes being cut in half, or birds being cut in half. So these were intentionally part of the design process by ancient Egyptians, so not by Christians or any other people in later times, which shows you again something about the theory of images in ancient Egypt. And one final example showcases like another type here where inscriptions written in pyramid burial chambers, which we call pyramid texts today, were intentionally modified after the execution. So you can see that there the line is half covered with plaster here, or covered with plaster here, or covered in plaster here to interact with this sign. And the interaction in every single case is basically the idea that all those images are able to somehow instantiate their reference. They have a potential to create a connection to their reference, whether it's a certain entity like a lion or an image of a god, but it can be also abstract powers, like, for example, the Ankh sign that represents life, which everybody knows. So they have this potential to create a connection to their reference. They are able to instantiate those references. Instantiate means bring them to the here and now, but they also allow the reference to be affected through magical means. Of course, everything is taking part in a magical reality. So there is this kind of two-way communication through images in a magical reality, and this is roughly the underlying theory of images in ancient Egypt. The basic thought is like in every other magical practices, which are called sympathetic magic, you take a part of an entity and you can affect that entity by modifying that part. So what images do actually, that they are able to make their reference ritually available. And this is a very significant thing. So first of all, there's not too much, there's a lot of overlap between what we would call glottography. As you could see, glottographic signs were modified as well. And secondly, these are all made available for the rituals through their power of instantiating their reference. So with this, let me go to the first case study of a stele of Marimas from Nubia from the time of Amenhotep III. So that's 18th dynasty, roughly 1300, 1400 BC. Rather 1400 BC, where there was a rebellion, and when putting down the rebellion, Marimas, who was the governor of Nubia, boasted about his achievements in putting down this rebellion and the achievements of the king putting down this rebellion, where he used a very particular sign in the middle of the stele that I will zoom in during the next slide, actually, and I will point out to you what is special about this sign and how it functioned in terms of these underlying theory, Egyptian underlying theory of images. So this sign is part of an expression, Mai Hesa, which would mean something like the ferocious lion. it is very often written with other lion signs. You can see that this lion is upright. He has a tail that is perked up and also has a sun disk on top of his head, which is something really special. You cannot observe it essentially in any of these cases where this name is written. It refers to the king as a ferocious lion trampling his enemies in Nubia. I took a look at other cases as well where you can see lions with hanging down tails and perked up tails as well. But generally speaking, none of them seem to have the sun disk on the head. And for that, I needed to go to another place to find an explanation what is going on in this text when it's talking about the king as a ferocious lion. And I found it. Of course, there are many other examples, but there's a particularly beautiful example from exactly the same time period. So Amenhotep III's time, one of the noblemen, in his tomb in Thebes, there was an image created about Amenhotep III, the pharaoh himself, sitting in a chair, on side of which there is a very nice little illustration that will help us out interpreting what is going on this stele. So if I zoom in on, you see the similar position of the pharaoh as a sphinx, a lion with a perk-up tail, and the sun disk on his head, trampling the traditional enemies of Egypt, one of which is a Nubian person, then is a Libyan person in the middle, and probably a Near Eastern person at the back. So you can see that the king trampling as a sphinx is a completely normal representation, especially at this time. It became, even earlier, it became really widely used. We can see versions of it created with a falcon-headed sphinx still trampling the enemies. And it got so famous that actually eventually it made it into Mesopotamia as well, where we can see local versions of the same image, but the people who are being trampled are probably local people from the region of somewhere in Mesopotamia. I don't exactly know where. So the motive of the king as sphinx with a solar disk on a head, with or without trampling enemies, is well established. I can even put them directly next to each other to show you the similarities, even though that this one in the written sign, the sign seems to have, of course, the head of a lion and not that of the king himself. But taking into account the other occurrences of this word Mai-Hesai, the ferocious lion, and this, especially with the solar disk on the head, we could say that this is a representation of a king who is a sphinx in this scale. Sphinx is, of course, a solar representation, a leonine representation of the king and the sun god at the same time, trampling the enemies of ancient Egypt. So what is it doing in this text, this image? It functions as a logograph for the sign lion, but at the same time, through its particular design, it radiates this sphinx-like power and the understanding of the king as a sphinx here. And as we could see it from other examples as well, even when signs are part of the hieroglyphic system, they do not stop functioning like images. So what this sign is able to do in this case is that exactly it brings here the sphinx aspect of the king, which is known from other cases as well in Nubia, the image of the king as a protective entity, not necessarily in a sphinx form, but in a human form as well. It was erected in forts for the local Egyptians to revere and to bring them protection as well. So probably this is the function of this image here, to bring here magically this protective power of the king as sphinx. So this is the first case study. Moving on, I would like to talk a little bit about the complementary nature of glottography and image in ancient Egypt. So, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, from the very inception of the hieroglyphic system, images and glottography, that is the notation of linguistic segments, mostly phonemes, so consonants or consonant combinations, was there. So Not to mention, of course, the fact that those signs that are used for glottographic purposes mostly are themselves small, understandable images, losing kind of like this iconic connection in the process of reading, but they were almost always complemented by an image at the end of the word. So image and glottography are hand in hand in ancient Egypt. They have a complementary nature and very often equivalent to each other in some senses. So let's take a look at this, the beginning of this process. So if we go to this very famous palette, the so-called Narmer palette, which is a cosmetic palette by perhaps its original function to grind paint and then apply it to the body, the paint would be ground here, but it's incredibly elaborately illustrated with scenes from the unification of North and South Egypt by the first king of the unified Egypt, who was called Narmer, who you see here, crushing his enemies, enemies here with cut off heads and other symbolic representations of the same victory. So on this image, we have very, very, very short glottographic notations, which is true for the first couple of hundreds of years of ancient Egyptian invention of glottography, which tells us that it was not linguistic recording that was the purpose of the earliest glottography, but rather was linguistic notation. And that is a different thing. Linguistic notation signalizes the presence of language, and why it does it is for a rather different purpose than recording information. Of course, it's part and parcel of that business as well. And this is underlined by the ancient Egyptian theory of utterances, which are always connected to some divine creative powers. The very name for the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic system itself was Medu Necher, which means words of the gods or divine utterances, which are always full of creative powers. So there are these magical ritual contexts when glottography originally appeared in ancient Egypt, always paired with the images that are able to connect to their reference, where glottography somehow makes this referential process perhaps a little bit more exact and imbues it with the power of creation. In terms of, if we want to understand it in terms of ritual processes, because all the early examples of Egyptian glottography come from ritual contexts like tombs and temples, basically. So there's a very good basis to understand these as parts of ritual processes. The images somehow stand for the ritual action that somebody and the ritual reference that somebody would act out or would happen, and the glottography represents the verbal utterances that go in hand with this. So somehow the theory of images and the theory of image utterances are intertwined together in ancient Egypt inside rituals as well, which is all and well when it gets to like simple images like an Ankh sign showing you that the power of life is instantiated, ergo it can serve as a protection. But what happens when we are dealing with really complex and very symbolic reference, like for example, this Narmer palette scene where the king unifies the country? What is the thing that is instantiated and put it into magical action right there? Well, actually, probably it is the effect of these depicted actions that is instantiated. And I will explain this, how it works, in a second. So why it is instantiated? For the sake of a ritual and for the sake of commemorating it for eternity, ergo the effects go on forever and ever in a magical reality. So for this, we can turn into other cosmetic palettes, which are very, very nicely decorated, like for example, the very famous Hunter's palette here, of which David Wengrow wrote an incredibly good idea, that the central part where the paint is ground actually is when representation that surrounds this center part meets reality. So the world of images meets the reality of people grinding those paints and connects it, imbuing the powder with power, so to speak, if I can allow myself this little joke. So imbuing the ground powder with the power from the images as well, which in the case of the Hunter's palette is probably the subduing of chaos, which is a very strong protective powder, perfect for magical purposes and then applied on the body, perhaps even for the sake of hunting. And in the case of the Narmer palette, Ludwig Morens's idea is very similar to David Van Gro's idea for the other palette, is that the act of grinding somehow maps onto the act of victory by the first king subduing his enemies. And then the two results are equated. The powder on the side of the grinding and the victory, the protective powers of the victory, they merge into together into one entity, which is then applied on the body of the ritualist, actually. So these are examples showing how these things are continually functional and alive after execution as well, although were probably created for one single ritual purpose, more or less. So we can observe the same in the case of other ritual objects which are otherwise dysfunctional in real life, like these gigantic mace heads, absolutely too heavy to use, but very elaborately decorated with images of some actions of the king. Again, the mace touches the body, just as a ritual knife with images touches the body, similarly to how the ground paint touches the body as well. So we can kind of conclude that the images in ancient Egypt are able to imbue reality with their symbolic content. They are able to represent this. They are able to modify reality. It is absolutely one of the ways of modifying reality in ancient Egypt. And one last example for this would be this beautiful object from the first dynasty, so just a little bit later than the unification of ancient Egypt went down. You can see in the middle an Ankh sign, and I put like a simplified representation on the right, which is a little bit more recognizable, surrounded by the so-called Ka hand. So the Ka arms, I'm sorry, they are surrounding arms. They have a lot of symbolic content to represent. So the Ka arms basically represent a type of life force that is transferred by a hug, an embrace. And this life force, everybody and this is the hug, the embrace is the reason that why it's depicted in a hieroglyphic form in a sign of these two arms, which are embracing the Ankh sign here. But this is the very same thing, this Ka, that takes the offerings to the deceased himself as well. So what do we see here is that the deceased two arms, his very life force, taking the symbolic power of life to himself, which, by the way, is formulated here as a vessel for ritual liquids, probably water. So the dead person would take to himself the life of water through these signs. Somehow, water is imbued with the power of life. Similarly, how the paint would be imbued with the image's power in the case of the palettes or the mace heads, and the knives would imbue their parts touching the bodies with their visual reference. So the Ankh sign, which is a symbol for life, imbues the water that is poured into its middle so that the Ka, the power, this life force can take it. So let's summarize. The general affordance of images and the theory of images and glottography in ancient Egypt is that images they're really able to instantiate reference. Reference can be both persons and abstract concepts as well. This establishes a two-way communication towards the reference of the images and from the reference of the images to the real-life participants of rituals. They have the potential of doing that. Probably they don't always do that. So please don't think about ancient Egyptians as some overly superstitious people who would freak out if they see an image. Probably they would approach it with cautiousness. But we know that images had to be activated to be able to do this. But at the same time, from the damaging of images, we can also see that some people thought that they were maybe probably always magically active. That's why they had to be damaged. I'm sorry, perhaps I didn't say this at the beginning. Why they were destroyed is to magically deactivate them so that their reference cannot have any kind of effect in the here and now. So these images are able to imbue real life actions like ritual actions with the powers when using the correct object. So they're able to transfer effects. So we can say that the affordance of images, on at least on one level, is that they can allow abstract powers and concepts be manipulated, usually in the framework of rituals. That's a big affordance. I want to do something with life force. I want to do something with abstract powers. What do? I make an image of it, and then I can manipulate it. I can affect it, but I can use it for my own protective purposes as well. Topped with these creative powers of ancient Egyptian utterances. Why they are creative? Because according to a few cosmogonies of ancient Egypt, not all of them, but the world was created with the help of a god, the first god pronouncing each part of the world, thereby bringing them into reality. Therefore, for ancient Egyptians, ritual utterances also had these creative powers, and this was transferred into the glottography that they had, which you could see that they are tiny, tiny, tiny little inscriptions at the beginning of this whole process, showing you that they were not created for the sake of information storing. It was part of it, but that's not their main purpose. Their main purpose was actually to create this kind of help facilitating, create a magical reality that was probably then interactable with for different purposes. And with this, I thank you for your attention. And here's the bibliography for some of the things, well, most of those images that I used during this presentation. And I would like to just allow myself one little thing, and I hope Pippa will not protest against this. I would just like to advertise a little bit my conference that is absolutely not a competition for Pippa's conference. Rather, we are actually thinking about a stronger cooperation. So our conference, with which we organize for 10 years now with our colleagues at the University of Warsaw, takes place every year in June. It's called Sign and Symbol. I know that some of you know about this. We still have an ongoing admissions process, so you could send us an abstract. This year it will be from the 22nd until the 24th of June. And we are really absolutely delving into very similar topics like what we discussed today. Not exactly the same approach, but you can check always my academia account where you can see the previous programs and you can see it for yourself. So what is going on there. So once more, thank you for the attention, and I'm sorry for this last little digression. Thank you for the whole thing.